Yeah,
All right, Herbie, you want to lead us into the first one?
absolutely. Topic numero uno is very near and dear to our hearts because it is a update from one of our, if not favorite, dev companies in the entire gamosphere. Today,
Bungo.
there was a lovely blog post on Bungie.net to inform the community about a um, a movement within the company, right? Where essentially they've committed to advocating for marginalized identities and underrepresented communities, suggesting that they deserve ample visibility, not just within the corporation, but outside of it as well. And to do that, they've started with the Black at Bungie. I forget what they call it. It's an IC, some sort of club. I forget what the actual technical term they had
Yeah,
for it
I can't
was.
remember, right, but it's some internal jargony thing.
Right. And so, they basically, like everyone's been doing, started a task force, which is like the new hot thing to do this year.
Yep.
You make a task force for everything. But it started earlier this year in response to the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and blossomed into an emblem and a pin that Reese and I are both proud owners of. So we get to rep our Be Heard paraphernalia in game, so that all the other Guardians know, that we are about that life. That Black lives do in fact matter. It says it right there underneath my name when they're looking at the kill feed and they see the Mothman posting aggressive numbers on there, as was the case for every game I didn't play on my Warlock. And honestly, reading about the initiative, the ways in which they're trying to be more proactive about it, was really inspiring because we've talked about this before. Gaming in and of itself is a pretty racist space. Digital media is inherently racist because it's built, owned, and operated predominantly by white cis hetero men. So that in and of itself is problematic, and gaming tends to then exacerbate that. Right, our identities become all the more virtual because no one can see us, and so whatever sort of presumptions people have about racial ethnic groups, they bring it into the digital space with them. And so it may not be nearly as bad as Call of Duty, but it doesn't suggest that there isn't that level of anti-blackness within the confines of the tower.
Yeah.
And it was nice to see a company that we've invested 7 years into, more than that, but Destiny wise 7 years, say openly and honestly, we're committed to this. We're going to commit to starting more of these advocacy groups within the company and trying to push for a more equitable community. I think the irony for me was that, like, we have already been calling ourselves the Black Vanguard for so long that I felt like we were owed some dues when the statement came out. I was like, so have y'all not seen us? Have y'all not heard that we already run this trap? I was dead ass thinking of quietly changing our clan name to the Black Guardian Caucus. Because I was like, I mean, at this point, like, they're basically
just
asking
lean
us
all
to.
the way into it.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Like, I'm already friends with a bunch of these people on Twitter, so I'm about to be like, yo, you wanna join the Black Guardian Caucus? Like, we gotta have meetings. Talk about
We
all
can
the
be
black shit under the Traveler.
That's been our tagline since the day I launched that Twitter account. All the black shit happening under the light of the Traveler. Herbie, I'm just skeptical, man. I'm not gonna lie. Like, am I heartened that Bungie's taking a principled stance? Yes, absolutely. And when I think about the responses that we saw from like peer publishers and peer developers, particularly over the summer, I think Bungie's response felt more earnest and robust, to their credit. I think about, like, Activision and oh my god, and who's the publisher for Modern Warfare, or who's the developer? It's not
Infinity
Treyarch.
Ward?
Infinity Ward. I really want to say Respawn because that's where all the talent went. There, I said it. You know, like Infinity Ward puts up like their little, you know, every time you remember, like every time you loaded in, it was like, we support black people, blah
Mhm.
blah 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 blah, whatever. Totally, like literally insignificant because it was just this opening salvo, like this opening message, and then nothing like changed materially, right? I've never gotten a message from Infinity Ward or Activision that was like, "Hey, we received your report for vapid racism. Um, you know, gamer so and so has been banned or has received a sanction." Like, you know, it was like, "Okay, nice message, Activision," and then I get called the N word on the internet. So, you know, I think Bungie's efforts have been better than that of their peers, but that's a low ass bar. That's a low ass bar, you know. And so I'm not about to find merit badges to pin on their chest, and I'm not about to give them a fucking cookie for doing the bare minimum. Now, so here the questions I always ask myself about this is, you're right. Like we're in a place right now where like task force is like the thing, right? And you gather like your tokenized brain trust, oftentimes the folks who've been doing the work ever since the beginning. You don't pay them any more money. You comprise this task force, and it sounds hardcore. And then the task force engages in some kind of fact finding mission and makes some kind of recommendation to the institution, and then nothing happens, right? Like it's like the audit culture of the 2000s all over again, right? Like we collect this data, and then the moment that the data isn't flattering or marketable, we fucking bury it. And so, you know, honestly, like when you sent me that text and it said Black at Bungie, I was like, oh shit, Instagram got these
I
motherfuckers
thought the
too.
same thing. I really thought, I was like, "Oh shit, did this just happen in like the dev space and we missed the bubble?"
Yeah, that's what I thought. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not looking for like the spice. Honestly, like I don't. I'm sure there's like tea at Bungie in the same way that there's tea here and there's tea at Con and you got right. Like there's no like salubrious pro-black institution, and even pro-black institutions are rife with their own issues.
Mhm.
But so when I think about this initiative led by Bungie, I ask myself, of course, is affinity space enough? You know, and there are moments for me as an employee where like distinctly black spaces are everything, right? You know, and I tell my like white colleagues, like, I'm telling you right now, after y'all leave, we stay back to unpack the caucasity of what just happened. Like I'll never forget being at work, and it was just like even split of colleagues of color and white colleagues, and you know the white folk were talking crazy, and it's one of those things where everybody's like, and so the meeting breaks. No one had to say anything. We just stayed back. At one point, once we had a quorum, as it were,
Mhm.
somebody closed the door, and it was just like, can you believe this shit?
Right.
Right? So, like, yes, affinity spaces really matter, and they can be really affirming, and they can be these like soundboards. They can also be just like a break, a reprieve, right, from the that sort of like dull, aching, like the mundanity of day to day racism, for sure. But my question is, does this change the material conditions of their labor? Right? Like, okay, so you've got a club, cool, but like, is there like what's that club's relationship to HR? Um, are there like executive decision making bodies that are informed of what comes? Like, is it just social, or is there some kind of like bigger function that this group serves? Right? Like, don't get me wrong, like, yeah, I'm down to get together for the black potluck, but when we're talking about race and racism at my job, that joint is not enough, you know. And I get it, like to your point earlier, like these convert like the gaming space is just so far behind the curve that, you know, like they have to start somewhere, right? The Bungie has to start somewhere, and this is their start. Good on them. But I also don't want to hold them to the low bar to which they've been held for so long. Not
Mhm.
just Bungie, but other publishers and developers. And I think too about like I think about our pin, man. Like that shit kicked ass. I loved it. And of course I bought it, right? But consumption and anti-racism are not the same thing. You know what I'm saying? For all we know, like Bungie made a grip off of these pins, and it sucks to be black and work at Bungie. You
Right.
know
Well,
what
I
I'm
mean,
saying?
I
And
think
so
I think they were somewhat transparent about this and the Pride pin both donating proceeds to who was it? It was like EJI or something like that it went to.
yeah. It was to EJ, which is like fucking incredible. But my thing is though that even if it doesn't generate financial capital, it totally generates social capital for the
Correct.
organization, right?
Yeah.
Like, and in a moment where honestly, like having those social justice accolades is increasingly like economically, financially advantageous. Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that Bungie's being shisty. I'm just saying like we have to hold them to a high bar.
Hmm.
And I don't have any friends who work at Bungie, but if somebody who works at Bungie like hears this or watches this, I hope that they can reach out and tell us like how we, the player base, folks who bleed all over this game, I mean, we're talking about a decade of our lives by the time it's done, by the time Destiny's done.
Hmm.
I've been playing Bungie games since 2004.
Yep.
So have you. So is Aries and Chris and JP. And so I'm invested in what happens in those offices. And so whatever we, the player base, can do to hold Bungie to that higher standard, I'd be interested in participating.
Honestly, I just want a job. You want to do anti-racism, right? Hire both of us. Like
Bungie.
we will set a precedent for the gaming community to be like, this is how you do this work properly. Because one of the things that really stood out to me was that they have a working relationship with one of the narrative leads.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, well, are we going to see some storylines that develop the characters' identities that would suggest who they are, where they come from, and how, race matters in the galaxy instead of how Star Wars handled it and a lot of other like space operas deal with people looking and acting and being perceived of as different? Right? Like we all know Shax is black. That's not a question. Like that he's just like the Idris of the tower. Except he's much louder. Right? Like that's it. We know it. Everyone knows it. It's just not said or spoken about. Or I mean, maybe we don't need it to be acknowledged, but at the same time, we kind of do. Like, you want to know that guardian is whoever you want them to be, or feel like they should be, that they're representative of you, right? That the storytelling, the histories of these characters, the things that they say, right, some of their mannerisms even, will harken back to stuff that feels genuine and is useful. That isn't just sort of that performative activism that we've talked about in
Right.
episodes past, right? That I think a lot of companies fall into the trap of when they engage in these initiatives. And I do wonder how many Guardians got turned off to the game when the Pride pin came out and when the Black Lives Matter pin came out. Like, how many people were out there and were like, wow, this company that I like all of a sudden is advocating for all this social justice stuff, and it negatively impacts my perception of the gaming space, and now I no longer want in, right? I wonder if it had that effect. If any time that any corporation makes the statement, it actually has an effect on the player base, or if everyone's just like, gross, I'm gonna keep doing it anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gets back to just how little changed after Activision made their statement, right? I think that the question becomes like nobody's gonna make anybody buy a pin. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so you could totally just ignore it, right? When it comes to Bungie, like put your blinders on and be like, you know what, whatever. My politics don't align with Bungie's politics, but it doesn't impact my playing, so I'm not going to care. Right? That's what happened with Activision. They made their statement, but like you just press the A button and you can go back to calling people any kind of epithet.
You can
in
still
the
put
lobby.
Trump
It
in your
didn't
clan
matter.
tag. You can still
Right.
say whatever you want and do whatever you want. And,
right. I gotta say I do appreciate that they're like that even those folks were like, yeah, it's done, it's over, and you just don't see as many of them anymore.
Yep.
Um, I think I'd never thought I'd say this, but I think that the president could take a page out of the playbook of some Call of Duty trolls and just like concede.
He needs to channel a little bit more of the incel energy and just accept
So
defeat.
I can't even believe that I'm going to say this, but yes, yes. um, but you know, as far as like Bungie's concerned, I think that um, the question that when we're talking about this commitment to DEI work, to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and I know there's like a cacophony of emerging acronyms for this
God, every flavor
arena.
of that acronym stresses me out.
And what's interesting is that like a lot of the work, and I'm putting that in scare quotes, a lot of the supposed work that's happening is really about changing nomenclature and not actually at all about changing culture or work or paying people. And so, but for me in this arena, it's how is difference making a difference, right? And you know, narratively in Bungie, difference makes very little difference, actually, right? Like Guardians are resurrected with no memory of their previous lives, but conceivably, their blackness matters, their awokenness matters. You're not gonna tell me nobody goes up to Cade 6 and is like, so is it robotic down there or what? Right? Like in the same way that regular ass normal dickheaded people are just as ignorant right now. You're gonna tell me that the golden age was so golden, we laid down inequity, and I know that that is in fact part of like the narrative.
Yeah.
But and then humanity finds itself on the brink of extinction, and somehow we didn't revert to those baser instincts. Get the fuck out of here. And so it becomes one of those things where like, yeah, is it cool that like they're really powerful, awesome characters from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds and with all kinds of sexual proclivities and gender identities? Yeah, that shit is rad. But if it doesn't matter, if it doesn't make a material difference, if it's not reckoned with, if it's just a piece of flavor added to appease the DEI gods, then difference makes no difference. And we don't task the player with, as they progress through the narrative and make choices about how they want to like sit in that space, we don't ask that player to reckon with difference because it makes no difference. And so I think yes, I care deeply about Bungie's labor practices and what it means to be black at Bungie, deeply. But tell me a black story. Help me as a player tell a black story. I think that is a more demanding order. But and that's not just on we're naming Bungie because we've been playing Destiny nonstop, and it's our favorite game. But I have yet to see any AAA release reckon with that.
I think only right now, and as much as I want to knock it because I don't pretend to enjoy Sony. I think we're seeing the success of Spider-Man Miles Morales as the first testament to, like, once again, as the movie proved, you can tell this story. And like I've seen clips of the game, like my man speaks sign language. He busts out a little bachata when he's walking the streets of New York when music's playing. Like they played up his Latin heritage, his blackness, his ability to like communicate with those in his community, and are telling the story from the perspective of the character that, you know, those of us who've read about Miles know him to be. And the success of that game right now, I think, is proving that like that story and it mattering to who he is as Spider-Man, as opposed to all the other Spider-Man tales that we've known and loved as well, like is significantly different and important.
Yep.
And it's not detracting from people's love of Spider-Man. It's not detracting from the play experience. It brings something different that, as you said, matters.
Right. And I think we've been asked to like project ourselves onto white characters forever. Is it really that tall of an order to ask our white neighbors to say like, "Hey, there's something of you in this kid." And it might not be his blackness or his bachata dancing or his ASL, right? But there are pieces of him that you can map yourself onto that'll allow you to make this rich lasting connection. Because like my little brother, for example, Cello was like he was Spider-Man. Like he was just so taken with the character because he saw some of his own willfulness in Peter Parker.
Mm-hmm.
And Cello's always been like super artsy and artistic, and Peter's like proclivity, like his love of photography, like totally appealed to my brother, even though he couldn't articulate those things quite as like lucidly at 11. There, right? He saw that, and so if we're like looking to take seriously the idea that popular culture can shift, we are the Black Guardian Caucus. I'm just now seeing that. If we're looking to take seriously like the notion that like representation can shift consciousness, it's not just for us, right? Like, yeah, it's rad for me to like have mirrors that show me back to myself in the way that I see myself. But coño, we can do something different for white folk, right? Like, there's this idea that anti-racism, particularly in like pop culture, is only about producing more things for us.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways that's true, right? Like, yeah, make black shit for black people. But it then presumes that like those pieces are either not meant for a white audience or inaccessible to a white audience, or that white people will just never enjoy a black story. And what we saw with Enter the Spider-Verse is that they fucking could. That white folks could not only like really enjoy a black story, but like catapult it to being the crown jewel of the Marvel universe. It is widely considered the best Marvel movie.
Because it is. I just rewatched it.
Because it is.
Because it is.
Because it fucking is. It's incredible. And so, and I think part of that rides on a white audience having been like, holy shit, this kid's rad. And it's not like an outsiderness, right? It's not like, oh, I'm on the fringes looking in on a story that's not for me. It's that, I mean, it's Miles, right? Like in some ways, when you think about like his complexity and the intersections he sits at, like there is something for everybody. He tells a profoundly American story. Make more shit like that.
I agree. I think that we do need to diversify the storytelling, diversify the character possibilities, and that accessibility shouldn't be about targeting specific groups, right? That you shouldn't feel like when you're doing this work, you're appealing to a very particular segment of the audience every time you do it, and it's like one for you, one for you, one for you, and then we're good, right? That it doesn't have to be that cut and dry and rigid, right. But that there is crossover possibility so long as the story that's being told is legitimate and meaningful, and there's a level of, I don't know, like humanity to it. I think it's a very simplistic notion.
Yeah.
Really, like, just to attempt to be genuine in the intent, rather than like a gratification tactic of saying this is a means to a very specific end, right? The I'm here so I don't get fined mentality of like, let me just do this so you get off my back about it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that question, Herbie, proposes or presupposes, I think, a step even before people start coding a game. Right? If you want a development team to tell black stories, and I'm using blackness, right? Like, because we're black, and this is like, and we comprise the Black Vanguard or the Black Guardian Caucus. Like, if you want to fucking tell black story, and we can say this about any other like minoritized or subaltern group, but I'm just going to use us and our people for now. If you want to tell black stories in games, you need black developers. You need black writers. You need black sound engineers. It becomes really hard for that story to find resonance with a black audience when black people haven't been a part of like the production of this. And I think that, like I remember as a kid, wanting to write for comic books, and that felt so fucking far-fetched.
Same.
Similarly, I literally write for a living. I'm a published author. Dude, and I will never forget the first time I got published. I had like it was an existential like fuck up.
I believe it.
But even now, I'm 30 years old. I'm well published for the phase of my career that I'm in. I can't fathom writing for Bungie. I don't know how I do that. I don't know what career moves I would need to make to find myself pitching a DLC like a storyline. I don't even know if that's how that shit fucking works. So I say that to say, how many black writers are there who have never thought of writing a video game as a possibility?
Mm-hmm.
How many coders and designers and artists have never conceived that their talents could be channeled into the video game medium, because that has never been made a possibility for them, or has never been presented as a possibility for them, right? Systems of power operate by curtailing our imagination. And so here is where like literal like hiring and retention matters so fucking much. It matters so much for what you make. It is not enough to just have fucking Saladin be black and Ikora be black. I love that they're black, but they're black in color palette. Their blackness has no impact on the story.
Right. It almost makes you wonder, because right, you're talking about writing for comic books, and you know, for a little bit when I was still finishing my undergrad and I was an English rhetoric major, I was like, you know, it'd be cool if I could write for like one of my favorite gaming companies. I thought about Bungie and I thought about Gearbox, and I'm like, I would love to write some of these stories. I think they'd be fun and interesting. But I don't know that I ever thought about what that writing would look like if I were to account for my own lived experiences, the experiences of my friends, and incorporating them into that fantasy, right? Like, how does that work? Like, I think about when, for a brief period, I was writing like pseudo Destiny fanfic based on our clan, right? And I was like, how funny would it be to read a lore book and encounter Hydro, the warlock,
Guardian down.
struggling pre-raid encounter to put his helmet over his fro. Right, like the most random thing that you would never think of, but like a joke that we make all the time because his fro pushes his mic back, and so we hear him breathing into his microphone, and we know exactly what it is because he's told us. So now we can call him out on it. But it's still funny, and like I think about it in that like sci-fi holier than thou context, and I'm like, that shit would be really funny. Yep. And I of course, one of those moments where like it's funnier for some people than it is for others, but I think it's still just like generally comedic. Mm-hmm. I don't think you'd have to be part of any particular social group to not laugh at that shit. Mm-hmm. Right? Like that's the most minute example of how that work can be done in just like these really subtle, beautiful ways. Like we talk all the time, we just want a book. We want a book that tells these stories that we can just sit and read until we die. That I will read to my kids when they're trying to fall asleep. Right? Like I will tell you the story of the first time Guardians ascended into the Hellmouth. But I want there to be a couple Guardians who, my kid can be like, that might be me one day.
Yep. Yeah. That shit matters, man. Like it's not everything, but it does. It does, and I feel like I'm always even though like I'm far more like materialist in my approach to these issues, I'm reminded that like representation still fucking matters. And our kids being able to see themselves as heroes when we read to them a story, or invariably when your kid is like, Dad, I can't beat this boss, can you help me? Like envisioning themselves as the heroes of the stories that we ask them to play or read or listen to, or whatever the fuck it is that you do to like enjoy narrative. That moment of seeing yourself in those people is tremendous. It's like, I mean, I will never forget watching Into the Spider-Verse because it touched a part of my childhood that had been left gaping and open. it was a story I needed when I was 8, and I was infinitely grateful to get it at 26 or whatever it was. But it was like I couldn't even articulate that need then, right? And I think that's one of the sort of like, I guess the tragedies of childhood, right? Is like not even being able to articulate those longings until you're much older, at which point, like, maybe the opportunity's gone. And so that's why I think it becomes so much more important that, like, we tell the Black stories now. We write the Black stories now. And it's not to say that, like, white folk can't do that work. It's just they can't do that by themselves.
No, certainly not. You got to be in the room. They
100%.
you got to be in the room.
Yeah, nothing about us without us.